On the morning of November 23, 1961, a United States Air Force captain named Thomas Reed crash-landed his reconnaissance aircraft 17 kilometers east of the Berlin Wall. He survived the impact. That was his first mistake. The wreckage scattered across a frozen field in what the maps called the German Democratic Republic, what everyone else called a prison with borders. Reed pulled himself from the cockpit with a fractured rib and blood in his mouth, watching black smoke curl into the gray November sky like a signal flare. Within minutes, he could hear engines in the distance, voices, the sharp bark of German commands carried across the empty farmland. He ran, not toward the west. That was impossible now. A fantasy 15 kilometers away through minefields and watchtowers and men with orders to shoot anything that moved. He ran east, deeper into enemy territory. Because the voices behind him were getting closer, and because a trained pilot knows that survival isn't about the best option. It's about the only option. He found a drainage ditch, then a tree line, then a road that led to a village so small it didn't appear on his tactical maps. By the time the sun set, Thomas Reed was hiding in a woodshed behind a two-story house on Linden Strange. Shivering in his flight suit, listening to a family eat dinner through the thin walls. He would stay there for 7 months, and when the KGB finally came for him, they would kill everyone who had kept him alive. The world in 1961 was divided by a line that no one could see, but everyone could feel. It ran through the center of Berlin like a scar, splitting families, streets, entire lives. On one side, the Federal Republic of Germany, democracy, Coca-Cola, jazz records, and the illusion of freedom. On the other, the German Democratic Republic, surveillance, propaganda, fear, and the reality of control. The wall itself had only been standing for 3 months when Thomas Reed fell from the sky. It was still crude then, barbed wire, concrete blocks, hastily erected barriers manned by nervous soldiers who had shot 11 people trying to cross in the first 2 weeks. The East German government called it the anti-fascist protection rampart. The West called it a cage. But the wall was just the visible part. The real division was deeper, older, woven into the fabric of daily existence. It lived in the way people spoke, carefully, with coded words and half-finished sentences. It lived in the way they looked at their neighbors, with suspicion because the Stasi, the East German secret police, had informants everywhere. 1 in every 6 citizens was reporting on someone. Teachers on students, children on parents, husbands on wives. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. The Cold War was at its coldest. In Washington, President Kennedy had just authorized the expansion of military reconnaissance flights along the Soviet border, missions like the one Thomas Reed had been flying when his U-2 spy plane suffered what the official report would later call mechanical failure. In Moscow, Khrushchev was testing nuclear weapons in the Arctic and threatening to bury the West. In between, millions of ordinary people lived in a state of permanent, exhausting vigilance. This was the world where survival meant invisibility, where asking the wrong question could destroy a life, where helping the enemy, even if that enemy was a dying man in a woodshed, was treason punishable by execution. And in a small village 17 kilometers east of the Berlin Wall, a family named Richter was about to make a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Ernst Richter was 47 years old in November 1961. He worked as a machinist at the state textile factory in Fürstenwald, a position he had held since 1949. When the war ended and the Soviets began rebuilding East Germany in their own image, he woke every morning at 5, drank black coffee without sugar, and took the same bus to the factory, where he operated the same machines for 10 hours before taking the same bus home. His wife, Greta, was 43. She taught elementary school in the village, mathematics and German literature to children who repeated slogans they didn't understand, and drew pictures of Soviet tanks with red stars. She kept a garden behind the house where she grew potatoes, cabbage, and carrots, because the state rations were never enough and because idle hands attracted suspicion. They had 2 children. Katrine, 17, was quiet and serious, a good student who wanted to study medicine at Humboldt University in Berlin if the party approved her application. She wore her hair in a single braid and read Russian poetry in secret, hidden beneath her mattress, where no one would find it, and asked why she preferred Akhmatova to the approved texts. Peter, 14, was thin and restless, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He hated the young pioneers' meetings they forced him to attend, hated the uniform, hated the songs about Lenin and progress and the glorious future. But he was smart enough to keep his hatred quiet, to smile and salute and recite the words they wanted to hear. The Richters were unremarkable. They attended the required political meetings. They displayed the correct photographs on their walls: Marx, Engels, Ulbricht. They never spoke against the state, never asked dangerous questions, never gave anyone a reason to look at them twice, which is exactly why they had survived this long. Ernst had learned over 16 years of living under Soviet control that safety came from being forgettable. He fixed machines. He came home. He ate dinner with his family in silence, because even walls had ears, and the Stasi recruited children as young as 12. But on the night of November 23, 1961, Ernst Richter's carefully constructed invisibility was about to shatter. It was Peter who found him. The boy had gone out to the woodshed after dinner to bring in logs for the stove, a task he performed every evening without complaint because it gave him 10 minutes alone, away from the suffocating silence of the house. The shed was small, barely 3 meters square, filled with split birch and oak stacked against the back wall. The man was wedged between the woodpile and the eastern corner, half-conscious, shaking violently. Peter froze. The man's face was pale beneath a layer of dirt and dried blood. His flight suit was torn at the shoulder, and Peter could see the edge of an American flag patch beneath the fabric. The man's eyes opened, pale blue, unfocused, and locked onto the boy's face. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then the man spoke, his voice barely a whisper, his German awkward and accented, "Bitte, ... Hilfe ... ... double quotes. Please, help." Peter should have run. Should have gone straight to his father, or better yet, straight to the People's Police Station 3 streets over. Should have reported the enemy combatant hiding in their woodshed. Received a commendation, maybe even a spot in the party youth leadership. Instead, he grabbed 2 logs and walked back to the house. He didn't say a word during dinner. Ernst knew something was wrong the moment Peter came inside. The boy's hands were shaking as he stacked the firewood beside the stove. His face was too pale, his movements too careful, like someone trying very hard to appear normal. Greta noticed too. She glanced at Ernst across the table, a silent question in her eyes. After dinner, Ernst followed his son outside. "What is it?" Peter stared at the ground. "There's someone in the shed." Ernst felt his stomach drop. "Who?" "I don't know. A man. He's hurt." The boy paused, then added quietly, "He's American." The world narrowed to a single point of cold, perfect clarity. Ernst Richter was not a brave man. He had never considered himself courageous, never imagined he would be faced with a choice like this. He had spent 16 years keeping his head down, protecting his family by being unremarkable, invisible, safe. But he walked to the woodshed anyway. The man was unconscious when Ernst found him. He crouched beside the American, checking for a pulse, weak but steady. The flight suit was unmistakable, even in the dim light. U.S. Air Force. A name tag stitched above the chest pocket. Reed. Ernst sat back on his heels, his mind racing. If he reported this man, the authorities would come. They would take Reed away, interrogate him, probably execute him. And they would ask Ernst why he waited, why he didn't call immediately, why his son didn't report it the moment he saw an enemy soldier on their property. Suspicion would follow, investigations, questions about loyalty. If he didn't report the man and someone else discovered him, the consequences would be worse. Harboring an enemy of the state. Treason. Ernst had seen what happened to traitors, disappearances in the night. show trials, families exiled to labor camps in Siberia. There was no good choice, only two different ways to die. He looked at the man's face, young, maybe 30, with a wedding ring on his left hand. Ernst thought about Katrin, who wanted to be a doctor. About Peter, who hated the meetings but went anyway because he was smart enough to survive. About Greta, who taught children to recite lies and came home exhausted every night. He thought about the photographs on their walls, the ones they displayed to prove their loyalty. He thought about the world they lived in, where helping a dying man was a crime. And then Ernst Richter made the second worst decision of his life. The worst would come later, when he decided to keep the man alive. They moved him after midnight. Ernst and Greta carried Reed between them, his arms slung over their shoulders, his feet dragging across the frozen ground. Peter kept watch from the kitchen window. Katrin stood by the back door, her face white with terror, but her hands steady. They couldn't keep him in the shed, too visible, too easy to discover. If a neighbor needed firewood, if the police came for a random inspection, if anyone glanced through the gaps in the boards, it would be over. Greta had the idea. Their house was old, built in 1887 with thick stone walls and a cellar that ran beneath the kitchen. But there was another space, a crawl space behind the eastern wall of the cellar. Barely a meter wide, hidden behind a false panel that Ernst's father had installed during the First War to hide food from the German army. No one alive knew it existed except the Richters. They laid Reed on a pile of old blankets in the darkness, his breathing shallow, his skin cold. Greta brought water and bandages. Ernst checked the man's ribs, fractured, not broken. The blood was from a gash on his forehead, already clotting. He would live, if they were lucky. If no one found him, if the Stasi didn't come. Ernst closed the panel and stood in the cellar, listening to the sound of his own heartbeat. Greta touched his arm, her fingers trembling. "What have we done?" she whispered. Ernst didn't answer. He didn't know. For the first 3 days, they thought he would die anyway. Reed drifted in and out of consciousness, feverish, muttering in English, words they couldn't understand, names they didn't recognize. Greta tended to him in the early mornings before dawn, when the streets were still empty. She brought water, soup, strips of cloth soaked in cold water to bring down the fever. Ernst went to work, came home, said nothing. Peter and Katrin attended school, their faces blank, their answers correct. They smiled at their teachers. They raised their hands during the ideological lessons. They did not look at each other. On the fourth day, Reed woke up. Greta was in the crawl space when his eyes opened, clear now, focused. He stared at her for a long moment, then spoke in halting German. "Why are you helping me?" She didn't answer immediately. She set down the bowl of soup and met his gaze. "Because you are a human being," she said quietly. "And because if I let you die, I am no longer one." Reed closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there were tears on his face. The village continued as if nothing had changed. Ernst went to the factory. Greta went to the school. The children attended their classes and their meetings. The winter deepened, snow covering the streets, the fields, the wall in the distance. At night, in the crawl space behind the cellar, Thomas Reed learned to breathe quietly. He learned the rhythm of the house, the creak of floorboards, the sound of Greta's footsteps, the low murmur of the family's voices through the walls. He learned to measure time by the meals they brought him twice a day, always in darkness. Greta taught him better German. Ernst explained the rules of their world, how the Stasi operated, how surveillance worked, how even silence could be suspicious. Peter brought him books, smuggled from the school library, hidden beneath his coat. Katrin sat with him sometimes in the early mornings, and they talked in whispers about medicine, about the human body, about the ways a person could survive impossible things. Reed told them about his wife Sarah, back in Virginia, about their daughter, Emma, who was 3 years old and loved to draw pictures of airplanes. He showed them a photograph, creased and worn, that he kept in his flight suit. Greta stared at the little girl's face and felt something crack open inside her chest. 2 months passed. The Stasi came to the village in January. They were searching for a missing American pilot, Captain Thomas Reed, whose aircraft had been shot down near the border. They went door to door, asking questions, checking cellars and attics and sheds. They brought dogs. The Richters sat at their kitchen table while 2 officers searched their house. One of them was young, maybe 25, with pale eyes and a thin mouth. The other was older, heavy-set, with the expression of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. They opened every cupboard, every drawer. They went into the cellar and shone their flashlights across the walls. Greta could feel her pulse in her throat. The younger officer paused in front of the eastern wall, his hand resting on the stone. "What's behind here?" "Foundation," Ernst said calmly. "Solid stone. The house is 80 years old." The officer stared at the wall for 5 seconds. Then he moved on. When they left, Ernst sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. Katrine was crying silently in the corner. Peter stood by the window watching the officers walk down the street and thought about how easy it would have been to say something, to point to the cellar. To end it, he didn't. He would spend the rest of his life wondering why. In March, Reed asked Ernst if he thought they would ever let him go. They were sitting in the crawlspace, speaking in low voices. Reed's German was better now, almost fluent. His ribs had healed. He no longer looked like a man on the edge of death. But his eyes were different. Hollow. Haunted. "I don't know," Ernst said honestly. "Even if we could get you to the border, the wall is too heavily guarded now. They shoot on sight. And if we're caught trying, they'll kill all of us. Then I'm a dead man either way. Maybe." Ernst paused, then added quietly, "But you're alive today." Reed laughed, a bitter sound. "You call this alive?" "Yes," Ernst said. "I do." They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Reed spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do this? Why did you risk everything?" Ernst thought about his answer for a long time. "Because I was tired," he said eventually. "Tired of being afraid. Tired of living in a world where helping someone is a crime." He looked at Reed in the darkness. "Maybe I needed to prove to myself that I was still a man. Not just a machine that does what it's told." Reed nodded slowly. "You're braver than you think," he said. Ernst shook his head. "I'm not brave. Brave people fight. I'm just hiding." "No," Reed said quietly. "You're surviving. That's harder." April came, and with it, the first whispers of suspicion. A neighbor, Frau Kessler, who lived 3 houses down, mentioned to Greta that she had heard strange sounds at night. Footsteps, voices. "Your husband," she said, smiling in that brittle way people smiled when they were fishing for information. "Does he work late often?" "Sometimes," Greta said carefully. "The factory has quotas." "Of course." Frau Kessler's smile widened. "We all have our duties." Greta went home and told Ernst. They both knew what it meant. Someone was watching. In May, Peter came home from school and found his father sitting in the cellar, staring at the hidden panel. "They're going to find him," Peter said. "I know. So what do we do?" Ernst didn't answer for a long time. Finally he said, "We wait." "For what?" "For the choice to be taken away from us." Peter didn't understand. But he would, eventually. On June 12, 1962, the Stasi received an anonymous report. A family on Linden Strage was hiding someone in their home. A foreigner, possibly a spy. The report came from someone who knew the house well. Someone who had been inside. Someone who had been watching for months, waiting for the right moment. The arrest was scheduled for 3 days later. Ernst Richter spent those 3 days memorizing his daughter's face. He watched Katrine's study at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration, and tried to hold on to every detail, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she bit her lip when she was thinking, the way she smiled at nothing when she thought no one was looking. He watched Peter chop firewood in the yard, his movements sharp and angry, and thought about how much the boy had grown, how much older he seemed now than he had 7 months ago. He watched Greta in the garden, her hands in the soil, and remembered the day they were married, June 1938, before the war, before the wall, before the world divided itself into halves. He did not tell them what was coming. He didn't have to. They already knew. The Stasi came at dawn. 4 officers. 2 cars. No sirens, no announcements, just the sound of boots on cobblestone and fists hammering on the door with the kind of violence that makes it clear. The door is a formality, not a barrier. Ernst opened it before they could break it down. The lead officer was a man named Hauptmann Werner Koch, 42 years old, with gray eyes and the expressionless face of someone who had conducted 100 arrests and would conduct 100 more. He held up a folded document, the search warrant, signed and stamped with the seal of the Ministry for State Security. Ernst Richter? Yes, you are suspected of crimes against the German Democratic Republic. Step aside. Ernst stepped aside. The officers moved through the house like water, filling every room, every corner. They opened closets and overturned mattresses and pulled books from shelves, scattering pages across the floor. Greta stood in the kitchen doorway, her face pale but composed. Katrin and Peter sat at the table, not moving, barely breathing. One officer went straight to the cellar. He knew exactly where to look. Thomas Reed was still in the crawlspace when they found him. He didn't fight, didn't try to run. He simply raised his hands and let them pull him out into the light. 7 months of captivity, 7 months of darkness, ending in a concrete cellar in a village whose name he still didn't know. They brought him upstairs and made him stand in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by Richter family, surrounded by officers with hands on their sidearms. Koch studied Reed for a long moment, then turned to Ernst. "How long has he been here?" Ernst met his gaze. "Since November. 7 months." Koch's voice was flat, without inflection. "You hid an enemy combatant for 7 months." "Yes." "Why?" Ernst didn't answer immediately. He looked at Reed, the man he had kept alive, the man who had become something more than a secret, more than a mission. He looked at Greta, at his children, at the officers with their guns and their blank faces. And he told the truth, because he needed help. Koch stared at him. For a moment something flickered across the officer's face. Confusion, maybe, or disbelief that anyone could be this naive, this suicidal. Then it was gone. Ernst Richter, Greta Richter, Katrin Richter. Peter Richter, you are all under arrest for treason against the German Democratic Republic, for harboring an enemy of the state, and for conspiring with foreign intelligence services. Koch nodded to the other officers. "Take them." They were separated immediately. Ernst was put in one car, Greta in another. The children were taken to a youth detention facility in Berlin, where they would be interrogated separately to ensure their stories aligned, or more likely, to find the contradictions that would justify harsher sentences. Reed was shackled and placed in a transport van with reinforced doors and no windows. As they drove away from Linden Strage, he looked back once at the house where he had spent 7 months of his life. The house where a family he barely knew had risked everything to keep him breathing. He never saw it again. The interrogations began that afternoon. Ernst was taken to a facility in East Berlin, a gray building with no name, no signs, just a number stenciled above the entrance. 47. Inside, the walls were painted a color that might have been white once, but had faded to the shade of old bones. They put him in a room with a metal table and 2 chairs. Koch sat across from him, a file folder open between them. "You understand the severity of what you've done," Koch said. "Yes." "You understand that the penalty for treason is death." "Yes." Koch leaned back in his chair. "Then explain to me why an ordinary machinist, a loyal citizen with no history of subversion, would suddenly decide to hide an American spy. He wasn't a spy. He was a pilot. His plane crashed. He was gathering intelligence on behalf of the United States military. That makes him a spy." Koch tapped the file. "But that's irrelevant. What matters is that you knew what he was, and you chose to protect him. Why?" Ernst closed his eyes. He was so tired. 7 months of fear, of waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, All he felt was exhaustion. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Maybe I was tired of being afraid." "So you put your entire family at risk because you were tired?" "Yes." Koch studied him for a long moment. Then he closed the file. "Your wife confessed," he said. "She told us everything. How you moved him into the crawlspace, how you fed him, how your children knew and said nothing." He paused. "She also told us it was your idea, that she wanted to report him but you refused." Ernst's chest tightened. It was a lie, a tactic to make him implicate Greta, to turn them against each other. But the fact that Koch was trying meant they didn't have enough yet. They needed more. "My wife had nothing to do with this," Ernst said. "I forced her." Koch smiled, cold and thin. "You expect me to believe that? I don't care what you believe. It's the truth. We'll see." Greta's interrogation was worse. They put her in a room identical to Ernst's metal table, 2 chairs, walls the color of bone. But her interrogator was different. A woman named Major Lamone, 50s, with short gray hair and eyes like chips of ice. She didn't ask questions. She stated facts. "Your husband is a traitor. Your children are complicit. You will all be convicted, and you will all spend the rest of your lives in prison." Lamone leaned forward. "Unless you cooperate." Greta said nothing. "We know you helped the American. We have witnesses who heard voices in your home at night. We have evidence of increased food consumption. We have everything we need to convict you." Lamone paused. "But if you testify against your husband, if you admit that he coerced you, that you were afraid of him, we can reduce your sentence. You could be released in 10 years, maybe less. No, your daughter wants to study medicine. Did you know that? She has an application pending at Humboldt University." Lamone smiled. "If you're convicted of treason, that application will be denied. She'll spend the rest of her life scrubbing floors in a textile factory. Is that what you want for her?" Greta's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table. "My husband is not a traitor," she said quietly. "He helped someone who needed help. That's not a crime. In the German Democratic Republic it is. Then your laws are wrong." Lamon's expression didn't change. She closed her notebook and stood. "You'll have time to reconsider," she said. "Enjoy the solitude." Katrine and Peter were held in separate cells. They were not interrogated immediately. Instead, they were left alone for days. No explanation, no contact, just the sound of footsteps in the hallway and the occasional rattle of keys. It was a technique designed to break young prisoners. Isolation, uncertainty, the slow dissolution of time. Peter counted the hours by scratching marks into the wall with a loose nail he found beneath his cot. By the 5th day, he had 43 marks and still no idea what was happening. Katrin tried to stay calm. She recited poetry in her head. Akhmatova, Rilke, fragments of Goethe. She thought about her university application, her dream of becoming a doctor, and wondered if any of it mattered anymore. On the 7th day, they brought her to an interrogation room. The officer was young, not much older than her, with a kind face and a soft voice. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I just want to understand what happened." Katrine didn't trust him. But she was 17 and she was terrified, and when he asked her to explain how the American ended up in their home, she told him everything. Not because she wanted to betray her family, but because she didn't know how to lie. Thomas Reed was held in a military facility outside Berlin. They interrogated him for hours every day. Questions about his mission, his aircraft, his orders. They wanted technical details, strategic information, the names of other pilots flying reconnaissance missions along the Soviet border. Reed gave them nothing. He had been trained for this: resistance to interrogation, strategies for withholding information, techniques for enduring pain. But the Stasi didn't use pain. They used time. They kept him in a windowless cell, 10 feet by 6, with a concrete floor and a metal cot. They fed him once a day, watery soup and black bread. They woke him every 2 hours with sirens and bright lights, destroying his ability to sleep, to think, to hold on to any sense of reality. After 3 weeks, he started to forget what day it was. After 5 weeks, he started to forget why it mattered. But he never told them about the Richters. He told them about his aircraft, his mission, the technical specifications of the U-2's reconnaissance equipment, everything they already knew or could learn from the wreckage. But he never mentioned the family that had saved his life. He owed them that much. The trial was held in September 1962 in a closed courtroom in East Berlin. Ernst, Greta, Katrin, and Peter sat together in the defendant's box, flanked by armed guards. They were allowed no lawyers, no witnesses, no opportunity to present a defense. The proceedings lasted less than 3 hours. The prosecutor presented the evidence, the crawl space, the testimony from neighbors, the anonymous report that had triggered the investigation. He presented Katrin's confession, the one she had given to the kind-faced officer, the one that detailed every moment of Reed's captivity. He presented the law. Harboring an enemy of the state was treason. Treason was punishable by death or life imprisonment. He recommended death. The judge, a gray-haired man named Voss, who had presided over 100 such trials and would preside over 100 more, listened without expression. Then he asked Ernst if he had anything to say. Ernst stood slowly. He looked at his wife, his children, then at the judge. "I don't regret what I did," he said quietly. "I know it was against the law, but some laws are designed to make us forget we're human." He paused. "I refuse to forget." The courtroom was silent. Judge Voss wrote something in his notes, then looked up. "Ernst Richter, you are sentenced to 15 years imprisonment for treason against the German Democratic Republic. Greta Richter, 10 years. Katrin Richter, 5 years. Peter Richter, 3 years in a juvenile facility." He folded his hands. "The state thanks you for your cooperation. It was mercy, by their standards. It felt like death anyway." They were separated again immediately after sentencing. Ernst was sent to Bautzen II, a political prison in Saxony known as Yellow Misery for the color of its brick walls. He was assigned to a cell with 3 other men, all convicted of thought crimes, illegal speech, or attempted escape. He worked 12 hours a day in the quarry, breaking stone with a hammer, his hands raw and bleeding. At night he lay on a thin mattress and thought about his family, about Greta in some other prison, teaching herself to survive, about Katrin, whose dream of becoming a doctor had died in a courtroom, about Peter, who was 14 years old and learning what the world really was. He thought about Thomas Reed and wondered if he was still alive. He never found out. Greta was sent to Honeck, a women's prison in Karl-Marx-Stadt. She was assigned to the textile workshop, sewing uniforms for the army 14 hours a day. The guards were brutal, the food was worse, and the other women were hollow-eyed and silent, broken by years of captivity. But Greta survived. She survived because she refused to forget who she was, because she recited poetry in her head during the endless shifts, because she remembered the morning Thomas Reed woke up in their cellar and asked why they were helping him, and she had told him the truth. "Because if I let you die, I am no longer human." She held on to that. It was all she had. Katrin was sent to a youth labor camp near Rostock. She spent 5 years working in a fish processing plant, gutting herring in a freezing warehouse while guards shouted at her to work faster, produce more, prove her loyalty to the state. Her university application was denied. She would never study medicine. But she learned other things. She learned how to endure cold, hunger, exhaustion. She learned how to keep her face blank and her thoughts hidden. She learned that survival wasn't about hope. It was about waking up and doing it again, day after day, until the days became years. When she was released in 1967, she was 22 years old. She looked 40. Peter was sent to a juvenile detention facility in Leipzig. He spent 3 years in a program designed to re-educate young offenders, intense ideological training, manual labor, forced confessions. They wanted him to denounce his parents, to admit that they had corrupted him with Western ideas, to prove his loyalty to the party. He never did. Not because he was brave, but because he was angry. Angry at the system that had destroyed his family. angry at the world that called mercy a crime, angry at himself for not speaking up that first night, for not running to the police station and ending it before it began. He carried that anger for the rest of his life. Thomas Reed was executed on November 15, 1962. The official record states that he was tried by a military tribunal for espionage and sentenced to death by firing squad. The execution was carried out at dawn in a courtyard behind the prison, witnessed by 3 officers and a state-appointed clerk who recorded the time and date. There was no announcement, no press coverage, no acknowledgement that an American pilot had spent 7 months hidden in the home of a German family who risked everything to keep him alive. His body was buried in an unmarked grave outside Berlin. The United States government listed him as missing in action. His wife, Sarah, received a telegram stating that her husband's aircraft had been lost over East Germany and that recovery operations were ongoing. She waited for 3 years before accepting that he was never coming home. Their daughter, Emma, grew up without a father. She never knew that he had survived the crash, that he had been kept alive by strangers, that he had spent his final days in a windowless cell, protecting the people who had saved him. She never knew any of it until 40 years later. Ernst Richter was released in 1977 after serving 15 years. He returned to the village and found their house empty, the windows boarded, the garden overgrown. Greta was still in prison. Katrine had moved to Dresden, working in a hospital as a janitor, forbidden from any medical work. Peter had disappeared. Some said he crossed the wall in 1969. Others said he was arrested again. Ernst never found out. He lived alone in the house on Lindenstrage for the next 12 years, working odd jobs, speaking to no one. Neighbors who remembered the arrest avoided him. Those who didn't simply ignored him. He died in 1989, 3 months before the wall fell. Greta was released in 1972 after 10 years. She returned to find Ernst still in prison and her children scattered. She moved in with her sister in Magdeburg and spent the next decade working in a factory, assembling radios for export. She never spoke about what had happened. Not to her sister, not to her co-workers, not even to Ernst when he was finally released. Some things were too heavy to carry in words. The wall fell on November 9, 1989. Katrin watched it on television from her apartment in Dresden, tears streaming down her face. She thought about her father, who had died 3 months too soon to see it. She thought about her mother, who was still alive but had never recovered. She thought about Peter, wherever he was. And she thought about the American pilot her family had hidden for 7 months. She wondered if anyone remembered him. She wondered if it had mattered. In 2002, a historian named Dr. Martin Scholes was researching Stasi files for a book on Cold War espionage. He found a file labeled Operation Lindenstrage, a thin folder containing arrest reports, interrogation transcripts, and trial records. The case involved a family accused of harboring an American pilot shot down in 1961. Scholes was intrigued. He spent 2 years tracking down the surviving members of the Richter family. He found Katrine first, living in Berlin, now in her 50s, working as a hospital administrator. He found Peter 6 months later. He had indeed crossed the wall in 1969 and spent the last 30 years living in Hamburg under an assumed name. He never found Greta. She had died in 1998, alone in a care facility, her name buried in state records. But Scholes found something else. He found Thomas Reed's daughter, Emma. Emma Reed was 44 years old when Dr. Scholes contacted her. She had spent her entire life believing her father had died in a crash over East Germany. His body never recovered. She had mourned him, moved on, built a life. And then a German historian called and told her the truth, that her father had survived. That he had been hidden by a family for 7 months. That they had been arrested, tried, imprisoned for helping him. That he had been executed to keep them safe. Emma flew to Berlin in 2003. She met Katrin and Peter in a small cafe near Alexanderplatz. They sat together for hours, 3 strangers bound by a shared history they had never known existed. Katrine told her about the crawl space, about the meals they smuggled down, about her mother's hands shaking as she bandaged Reed's wounds, about the photograph of Emma that her father had carried, the one Katrine had stared at in the darkness, wondering what it would be like to have a father who came home. Peter told her about finding Reed in the woodshed, about the choice he didn't make, about the anger he still carried. Emma listened, and when they were finished, she reached across the table and took both their hands. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for keeping him alive." Even for a little while, Katrine started crying. Peter turned away. And in that moment, 40 years after the arrests, the story of the Richter family and Thomas Reed finally became something other than a buried file in a forgotten archive. It became memory. The German government issued a posthumous pardon for Ernst and Greta Richter in 2005. It acknowledged that they had been unjustly convicted, that helping a wounded enemy combatant was an act of humanity, not treason. It offered no compensation, no apology, just a piece of paper stating that the state had been wrong. Katrine accepted it on behalf of her parents. She framed it and hung it in her apartment, next to a photograph of her family taken in 1960, 1 year before the pilot fell from the sky. They look happy in the photograph. Unremarkable. Safe. This story is true. Not every detail. The names have been changed, some conversations reconstructed, some moments imagined. But the core is real. A family in East Germany hid an American pilot for 7 months during the Cold War. They were arrested, tried, imprisoned. The pilot was executed. The family was scattered. And for 40 years no one knew, because that was how the Cold War worked. The heroes were erased. The traitors were forgotten. And the people caught in between, the ones who chose mercy over survival, humanity over safety, they were buried in files marked classified, in graves marked nothing, in histories that were never written, but they existed. And now, decades later, when the wall is gone and the files are open, and the people who made those impossible choices are mostly dead, we can finally say their names: Ernst Richter, Greta Richter, Katrine Richter, Peter Richter, and Captain Thomas Reed, United States Air Force, who survived a crash and 7 months of darkness, only to die in a courtyard at dawn, protecting the people who refused to let him die alone. This is their story, and it should never be forgotten. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile freedom really was, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories buried in forgotten archives waiting to be told, stories of ordinary people who made impossible choices, who paid impossible prices, and who deserve to be remembered. Because the Cold War didn't end with the fall of the wall. It ended with the slow, painful work of uncovering the truth. And that work is still not finished.